Welcome to Your Education Matters. Here you will find in-depth discussions about all levels of education presented by persons knowledgeable about the field. Here are data and analyses you have been looking for to help make your educational decisions. Dr. Joel Westheimer is University Research Chair in the Sociology of Education at the University of Ottawa. He is co-founder and executive director of Democratic Dialogue. He is a former teacher who received his doctorate from Stanford University. Westheimer teaches, researches, and writes on democratic engagement, social justice, activism, service learning, and community in education. He has published books such as Pledging Allegiance, The Politics of Patriotism in America's Schools, and What Kind of Citizen? Schools, Civic Education, and the Promise of Democracy. He also publishes widely in newspapers, magazines, and scholarly journals, and addresses radio and television audiences on shows in Canada and the United States. Westheimer has received numerous awards, including the Canadian Education Association's Whitworth Award, the Daniel E. Griffiths Award for Excellence in Education Research, and the Outstanding Research of the Year Award from the American Political Science Association's Division on Teaching and Learning. He has also been named a John Glenn Service Learning Scholar for Social Justice. We are pleased to welcome Professor Joel Westheimer to Your Education Matters. Thank you for thinking about Your Education Matters. Dr. Westheimer, some of your writing is in the area of democratic values, and I wondered if you'd explore with us what your concept of democratic values is and develop some of that specifically.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. It's a really interesting thing from the perspective of schools, because of course there are hundreds of philosophers that go back thousands of years talking about democracy and what it requires. But now, when you ask students and young people what they think democracy means or what it is, most people, even adults as well, say freedom. And of course, freedom is an element of democracy. It's a democratic value, but it's not it's a prerequisite, but not the full thing that democracy means. So, on the most simple level, we think of kind of government of the people, by the people, for the people. I mean, that's the cliche, and certainly that is a key democratic value, which is that people have a right to participate in determining the course of the community where they live and the larger nation and the world and the events that affect their lives. But what's less thought about these days is the idea that it's not just the right to have these things, that you have the right to vote or the right to participate in electing your leaders, right? Those are all important, but that you also do it. And so if I had to think about what my primary value in democracy is, that's not always included in the list, it's participation. And that's, I think, where schools have a lot of place to get involved, is the idea that kids need to learn to participate in community life and not just have the right to participate.
So it's something you make, democracy. It's not something that's given to you.
Yeah, some people, the saying democracy is not a spectator sport, right, I think is an important one. And when we think of how we watch the Olympics, we see experts who are, the talented athletes who we watch on the television or watch when we go to these events, and we take pleasure in enjoying those events. And sometimes democracy, especially from our media, is treated in the same way, right? We watch for example, in the U.S., the Republican, nomination debates, and we look at all our candidates in Canada and the U.S. argue things on TV. And for some people, that's like a spectator sport. You do that for a while, then you change the channel and you watch something else. Yeah. You look at, you watch Modern Family or Friends or something. And And people really need to understand that, of course, there is an entertainment value to politics. There's no question about that. But that's not all it is, of course, and it's not all it needs to be. That democracy has to be painstakingly constructed, and it's not something that just happens naturally. It's something we need to build with each new generation. Sometimes
this is described as a difference between freedom and liberty.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's, freedom, well, even more interesting, actually, is that the freedom to do something doesn't necessarily ensure that we are going to do it, right? And I think that where schools come in is having the very important role of ensuring that not only do people know that they have the right to do things, but encouraging them and teaching them how to participate in those things.
When I used to teach history of education, I used to say that originally education was for perpetuating the culture, especially through religion. And then when we evolved democracies, the notion of educating people to be citizens occurred. And then it came to us that education should be for the purpose of economic enrichment of our individuals and society. But I've always felt the best rationale for education was to create self-realized individuals who will then in turn join their communities, and they will serve those other purposes along the way. They will be good citizens, and they will be productive members of society, because all that's a part of being a self-realized individual.
Yeah, absolutely. And the whole economic language, right, around schools right now, I think is one of our biggest problems because of that, because it moves away from that idea of self-realized individuals. And even the students themselves now have little way of imagining themselves other than as economic agents. And this is the funny thing, and I'm curious what you think of this as well, but I've been on so many panels lately with a teacher, a couple of researchers, someone else, a parent, and an economist. There's always an economist there, right? And I always get a kick out of this because economists feel that they've got the full answer to how schools should run and how they should work, which always makes me laugh because they don't even seem to have a good take on how the economy works. So I don't know how they think that they know how schools work, right? But for them, the schools are an engine for feeding the economy and enhancing our global competitiveness. Now, we know there is no study that I know of that links what goes on in a school to the health of a nation's economy, right? We do know that whether people get an education, whether they graduate from high school and from university, absolutely affects their individual economic prospects, right? But this idea of, well, if we teach things one way, then we're going to flourish as a nation in competition with other nations, and if we teach another way, we won't. There's no real evidence for that. And so I would much prefer that schools be, of course we need to think about how we prepare students and what kind of jobs they're going to get, but that should just be one of many goals of education. And the primary goal should be, as you said, that students are able to explore the avenues that they find most satisfying in realizing their full selves, right?
When you speak of the economic narrative, and by the way, one thing I like the economists for is they want more preschool.
Yeah.
That's one thing. Let's just talk about preschool and get the economists out on that one because they believe there's so much return for every dollar spent in preschool. Right. If we can keep them focused on that, we can cooperate with them.
Yeah, exactly.
But the free market language and the economic metaphors, I wonder if what we're talking about is a myth or a narrative that guides people, and how we can reconstitute that myth or narrative so that it's a more productive one. If you don't like the economic one, where do we reach into our bag of tricks to get a better narrative?
I like going back to John Dewey, who, your first question that you asked me was, what are the principles of democracy? And for John Dewey, democracy was not just a form of government. It wasn't just a way of how do people vote for their leaders and how do they do that. For him, what he called it was an associated mode of living, right? And that living is such a rich word, right? It's how we live together as human beings who are social animals, who have some shared interests, some competing interests, and how we get along together. And he said that within his philosophy of democracy, but also in how schools should foster that. And I think what schools need to embrace is a vision of education that sees their mission as one concomitant with Dewey's vision, right? Which is that we need to teach students how to live together in a common society. One good example is politics. You know, people love to say that politics should be kept out of school, right? If I say, Paul, you're just being political, it's like I've hurled an insult at you, right? Like
we hear that a lot.
Right? Yeah, like politics is a four-letter word or something, and that's because everyone is thinking of mudslinging candidates running for office who have nothing but their own interests in mind.
Yes.
That's how the narrative goes, right? But politics never used to mean that, right? I go back to, like, for example, the classic work by Bernard Crick. He wrote the book called In Defense of Politics. And in that, he says politics are the way that a large number of people with differing interests and differing priorities come together to work out their differences and make social progress, right? How do we move forward? You think this, I think this. What are we going to do about it? Well, we're going to engage in politics in the sense that we're going to put our values on the table and figure out how we can move forward as a collective entity. And politics in that sense is an extremely positive thing. And so, you know, I often say everyone's always trying to keep politics out of the school. I want to bring it in, right? I think that's the most important thing that schools can have in it. And in fact, the school curriculum should be organized around a notion of politics. And here's an example of that, right? Let's bring the economist back for a second. It's because of economists and a large number of other forces on schools that we now have a highly emaciated curriculum that's focused almost exclusively on math and literacy, right? And we have to get a straw man thing out of the way first, right? Because I sometimes, like when I'm speaking, I'll ask people I'll say, you know, raise your hand if you're a member of educators and parents against kids knowing how to learn to read and write, right? Or against kids knowing how to add numbers or something like that, right? And then everyone chuckles and no one raises their hand. And of course, there's no such group, right? All teachers want kids to learn to read and write, and all teachers want kids to know how to do math, right? But most educators want a lot more than that, right? They want kids to be able to know what the reading means, what they should read, what's worth reading. They want them to know how to add numbers, of course, but they also want them to know what those numbers add up to, right? In other words, how can they put their education in the service of collective life? How can they connect it to what's going on in our society? And the idea that that schools should be narrowed to just these small subject areas is one that's very problematic for democratic life, because schooling is so much more than that, right? And it needs to be about more than that.
Thank you, Joel.
Yeah.
We'll be back in a moment.
When I arrived at SFU, I was ready to pursue my dream to become a physiotherapist, which all started back in high school with my passion for athletics. But then I took a health sciences course and discovered that at SFU, you have choices, incredible choices. It opened my eyes to a world of possibilities in global health. Possibilities for my future I had never considered, but I really struggled with letting go of my first goal. And that's when I found out how much support you get here. Incredible support, so you can really explore all those choices, think them through, and choose the path that's right for you. Faculty and staff paved the way for me and helped me navigate my new path, and I've never looked back. At SFU, you're part of a real community. The faculty and staff know who you are, what your interests are, and they really go out of their way for you. Research projects, conferences, international studies, co-op positions, student leadership. At SFU, you get the best education you could possibly hope for and the most support you could possibly ask for. And now that I've graduated, I'm packing my bags for Oxford to start my master's degree. Here's my plan. I see a need for better bridges between ideas and action in global healthcare, And if I can help build those bridges, that would be a really fantastic thing to do. I'm ready, and if you put your mind to it, you'll be ready too.
Dr. Westheimer, you introduced the term collective identity in our earlier discussion, and I'd like to bring that back and talk some about individualism versus community and what you mean by a collective identity and why that would be something you think we should aspire to in schools.
I think, so first of all, we tend to, in North America, think of individualism and community as opposing terms, right? And I think that's a bad place to start. Because here's the thing, when you're in a strong community, all of us know that it's in community that we recognize the individual strengths and weaknesses of its members, right? When there's no community, everyone is anonymous and seems the same, right? They're like interchangeable because we don't know people's strengths. But if I was working on a collective project with you, I get to know all the different dimensions, right, of Dr. Shaker. And I know you in a thick way, right? And that means that your individuality stands out to me and to everyone else in that community. And that's where we have a kind of misperception in our idea of what collective identity means. And I think that the right the far right has done a very good job of scaring people to death about what a collective life means, right? When collectivism goes towards everyone has to be the same, well, yeah, then you run into trouble, right? But we are so far from that situation that I don't think we have that worry, right? Our worry is alienation, anonymity, right? We have this
diseases of the soul.
Exactly, and we know that there's a rampant, epidemic of people feeling all alone, right? In our sort of diminishing bonds of community. We have this rash of, you go into a bookstore, right, and there's dozens and dozens and dozens of books on happiness. There's this rash of people pursuing what it takes to be happy, which is seen as an individual endeavor. The irony of it is that the lesson that we've learned from all the research and all the how-to books that tell you how to be happy have some very clear conclusions. One of them is that volunteering for things makes you happy. Helping others makes you happy, right? Having good friends makes you happy. Being associated with projects that are meaningful to you makes you happy. We also know that owning a fancy car doesn't make you happy. Buying the car makes you happy for a few minutes.
Winning the lottery.
Yeah, doesn't make you happy. There's no correlation, and in fact, perhaps an inverse correlation between above subsistence, once you have enough money to be fed and housed. There's no correlation between your wealth and your happiness, and it might even go the other way. And I think that's because with wealth, we often use wealth, and maybe this is human nature, for some reason to buy autonomy. To buy disconnection from everyone else. And we end up learning that we're not that happy autonomous, right? We like having a kind of interdependence with each other because we're social creatures.
Yes.
And so when I say collective identity, what I mean by that is that we gain a lot of our own selves and we learn to be our full sense of human beings from our identification with others. And schools, rather than emphasizing individual achievement and everything individual, right? Individualized test scores, individualized homework assignments. Instead of that, we should mirror more what real life is like. When I have to do, any of us who have to do some project at work, it's very rare that you will do that project all on your own. In fact, you have whole departments of different jobs that are devoted to breaking up material into what people are good at. And yet schools don't do that at all, right? If I have a deficiency in one area, why not work together with someone else who has a strength in that area? And we don't have enough opportunities to form that kind of collective bonds.
You're sounding very Dewey in there, and it reminds me of Foxfire, Elliot Wigginson's project in Georgia, where created a journal and brought life to an Appalachian school by all the students taking different parts of the project to document Appalachian culture and put it into the form of print and distribute it to people. It was a beautiful thing.
It was an amazing project, right? And one of the things that made Wigington's thing a success. Now, by the way, did test scores go up there? I mean, they didn't have the same testing that we had
People
here,
stayed
but
in school.
they did. They stayed in school, and kids learned how to read and write, right?
Yes.
But it wasn't putting the cart before the horse. There's no reason to learn to read and write and do all these crazy disconnected things if there's no purpose of it. So what Wigington found was the purpose.
Another way to talk about collective identity and freedom that I always remember, I heard it 25 years ago. I attended a talk by a Methodist missionary, and he said the real meaning of freedom is how you choose to give up your freedom. In other words, you may choose to get married, you may choose to have children, you may choose to give your time in some way or another for a charitable or philanthropic interest. And I've never forgotten that, because that was really the essence. You don't want to hoard freedom.
Yeah.
You want the freedom to choose how you invest yourself. And then you give it up in pieces until you're really captured by your responsibilities, but you've chosen to take on those responsibilities.
It's a really nice distinction, and some people, I think, mistake freedom of association with freedom from association, right?
Well, you haven't mentioned media and advertising, see, but I always, when I go to a park and there's nobody there, and you go to some synthetic amusement event and there's thousands of people there, I always think, well, they don't advertise the parks.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, exactly.
So the power of advertising, and why do people want a new car? They're told to want a new car over and over and over again, and they're told and they're shown in the most powerful ways people can conceive that this will make them happy.
Yeah, and the irony of it is we now have so much research, even with the brain research and scans, that we know what makes people happy, and what makes them happy is the opposite of what we tend to be pursuing.
Now this leads me to want to get into critical thinking, because it's another theme that ties together some of the things we've been talking about. If people were better critical thinkers, they could see through the advertising, they could observe themselves and notice what was really satisfying. They could look around in the environment around them and see who had productive and healthy lives. What can we do in schools to promote critical thinking?
Well, it brings us back to our discussion that we had earlier about politics, right? Where people want to say, I keep politics out of the school. and I think that one of the things that kids are not learning in school is how to deal with debate and conflict. And if we can think of any other key ingredient to what it takes to create a successful democratic society, it's the ability to deal with difference, right? To figure out how to come together and make sense of those differences. And yet, think about a teacher's role. The way schools are set up is so naturalized to us because we've all been in schools that we think it's normal. But it's not very normal. And we have a teacher who's in front of a group of kids, and kids almost never get to see that teacher as an adult interact with other adults, right? They never get to see teachers have opinions on things that matter, right? In fact, teachers are supposed to explicitly say, well, on the one hand and on the other hand, and then the students ask them, well, what do you think, Mr. Westheimer? And they say, oh, I don't think about this, right? I don't have an opinion on this. But teachers, like any human beings, should be passionate about things. That doesn't mean they should force their opinions on students, but they should have ideas. And what we need schools to do in terms of critical thinking is give students an experience, a set of experiences where they can engage in knowing that intelligent people disagree about important matters of our society, and that's okay, and that what they need to do, their job, is to look at a lot of information that's coming at them and figure out how best to move forward. We still have a curriculum that's based on the idea that what students need is information. That's a weird thing, because I have a cell phone in my pocket right now that can get me anything you ask me factually in about 4 seconds, right? Kids don't need information. None of us need information. We have too much information. What we need is the skills to be able to sift through that information and know what's important and how it comes together in matters of interest. And critical thinking, in its deep sense, is the ability to look critically at current social policies, at things people say, at things we read about on the web, and to ask ourselves, well, in whose interest would it be to put things that way? Why would it be that way, and how else could we look at those things? And unfortunately, that's something that doesn't happen enough in schools.
Thank you very much for being with us, Joel.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment. What does a public school have in common with a lighthouse? Their use is free, unlimited, and available to all. Using the school or the lighthouse does not reduce its availability. Everyone can use either without cost, without limit, or without qualifying. Together we have to decide which things are held in common and which provided in abundance, and which things are placed in the private competitive pool. This is a difficult choice and affects the balance between what we manage individually and what we manage in community. As so often in life, one can trade independence for security. If, for example, we tax ourselves to provide health care, we all pay for this service. We give up part of our economic independence, and in return, we achieve health security. Medicare is an invaluable support in one's personal and family life. The benefit of the lighthouse is less personal and tangible. Lighthouses save lives and property and make safer transportation available. We prosper from the increased trade and transit. Public schools build community. They create society. All types of schools can teach the 3 R's, but only the public school brings all description of children together. They learn to be together. They learn to work together. They learn from their differences. Public schools are the foundation of a multicultural society. Are we keeping our public schools free, unlimited, and available to all? If we are, our future is more secure. Our rising generations working together will move society forward in community. Thank you for thinking about Your Education Matters. Visit our archive and see past programs at youreducationmatters.ca.